The sky was dark over the refugee camp, full of thick gray clouds and smoke. Cold wind moved through the broken tents like fingers, touching every hungry stomach with fear. This was not Earth. This was the alien world of Thalvona Place. Once full of life, now ruined by war. And in the middle of this broken land, a human named Eric sat alone on a cracked stone. Holding a metal plate in his hands, the plate was almost empty. Just one small piece of rationed protein, dry bread, and 2 spoonfuls of water. It was his first food in 2 days, and maybe his last for the week. His hands shook slightly. But not from the cold. He was starving, still. He stared at the food without touching it. Children whispered nearby. Alien children, thin and tired. Hiding behind a pile of old blankets, their eyes were large, glowing slightly in the dark. One girl stood out. Her skin was light blue, her cheeks hollow, and her small arms wrapped around 2 younger kids beside her. She didn't speak, didn't beg. She only stared. Silently, Eric looked up and met her eyes. They were not the eyes of someone asking. They were the eyes of someone watching. Waiting to see what he would do, his stomach growled loudly. But he didn't move. Instead, he slowly stood up, walked toward the children, and knelt down. He didn't say a word. He placed the metal plate on the ground in front of them. Then he stood up and walked away. His face calm, his body weak, the blue-skinned girl blinked. The other children looked at her, unsure. But when she picked up the plate and broke the bread into small pieces to share, the others followed without question, behind a torn tent flap. An older alien watched everything. She narrowed her eyes, whispering to another elder beside her, "That human. He gave up his food. Foolish," the other spat. "They die like that, or they lead." The first replied slowly. Eric sat alone again, now with nothing in his stomach. But something had changed. He didn't know what it was yet. But eyes were on him now. That night, the wind grew louder and the cold sharper. The children had no fire, no heat. Eric saw them shivering under thin cloth. He didn't think twice. He got up, grabbed his old coat, and walked over. He laid the coat on the children and stepped back. Wrapping his own arms around himself, the blue-skinned girl whispered something to the others, then crawled closer to Eric and placed a piece of the bread back into his hands. He shook his head slowly, but she insisted. Their fingers touched for a brief moment. Hers were freezing, but her eyes were warm now. She said her name for the first time, barely a whisper. "Saya." Eric nodded. No words were needed. From a nearby tent, someone watched again. This time, it was the commander of the alien camp. He rubbed his chin and grunted. "Dangerous man," he muttered. "No weapon. I'm no army." Yet they gather around him. Morning came, gray and empty. But something was different. A few of the mothers, alien and scared, started pushing small bits of their own food toward the children. No one told them to. They just did it. Eric didn't ask for anything. He sat by the edge, fixing a broken water filter with his bare hands. Saya brought him a fruit, small and shriveled, but she smiled as if it was treasure. He smiled back, weak but thankful. In the center of the camp, the older ones began whispering more often. They said things like, "Why him?" And "He's only human." But others said, "He gives without asking." And even our own have forgotten how to care. A new energy had started, soft but spreading. And it all began with an empty plate and the silent eyes of a girl who had nothing left but hope. The camp was changing, even if no one said it out loud. People moved differently, slower around the human. Mothers began watching Eric the way they used to watch their lost elders, with eyes full of silent questions. Eric didn't act like a leader. He spoke rarely, worked alone, and kept his hands busy with fixing what he could: pipes, fire pits, broken cooking plates. But wherever he went, children followed, especially Saya, who now copied his movements without saying a word. She had started cleaning the area around their shelter, arranging stones in a small circle. Others saw her, and one by one, more children joined. Soon, the dirtiest corner of the camp had become the cleanest, not because anyone ordered it, because Eric had made it that way. Without orders, without words, the elders didn't like it. They met inside a broken command tent, arguing quietly. The human is shifting the balance, one said. He gives hope, and hope leads to rebellion. Said another, what has he done? A third asked, he only gave up a plate of food. That's exactly what we fear. The commander replied, only fools give when they have nothing but, that's what makes people follow. Eric didn't hear their whispers, but he felt. The stares, he had been in places like this before. Back on Earth, he recognized the signs of authority growing afraid. That night, the air turned colder than usual. The camp's small fire died out early, and the clouds above promised acid rain. People scrambled to cover their shelters. Eric saw two children crying. One tent had collapsed completely. Without a word, he walked over, tied up the supports, and rebuilt it using rope made from old clothing strips. The children's parents watched silently but said nothing. Saya came to help him, her small hands holding tools. Eric let her hand him a sharp stone. Together, they worked until the tent stood tall again. When they finished, Saya looked up at him, her voice barely above. The wind, they don't help each other anymore. Eric nodded. That's why we start small, he said. Someone nearby had been listening. An older alien woman who had lost her son in the last battle. She stepped forward and placed a wrapped bundle near Eric. Inside was dry food, 2 strips of grain loaf, and a fruit piece. For the children, she said, but her eyes were on him. Eric didn't argue. He simply handed it to Saya, who broke it in half and shared it again. The next morning, people found the center of the camp swept clean. Stones were arranged in a circle. Someone had drawn a human handprint in the middle using ash. No one admitted to doing it, but it was. They're bold and quiet, like the man they all now watched from a distance. Eric sat in silence, fixing a broken kettle, unaware of the symbol behind him. But Saya saw it and smiled. Because she knew now, something important had begun, and no one could stop it. Not anymore. The sun barely rose that morning, casting a pale light over the worn-out camp. Mist rolled through the cracks between tents, and the silence was heavier than usual. People whispered without sound, watching the same man they had once ignored. Eric didn't notice the shift, or maybe he did, but chose not to react. He just kept doing what he always did, helping, fixing, giving. But it was different now. Even the guards by the storage units glanced his way when he walked past. Saya followed, close behind, holding a sharp bone knife like it was a badge of honor. Not for fighting, but for peeling fruit, cutting fabric, preparing food. She had become something in between a shadow and a protector, small, silent, and always watching. Later that day, the High Elders held a gathering. They called it a council. But it felt more like a warning. Aliens with long robes and angry voices stood around a fire pit, facing Eric as he was brought in, not forced. But surrounded, he didn't flinch. He stood with dirty hands and an empty stomach while they sat. Clean and full, one elder, taller than the rest, leaned forward. You have made the children forget their place, he said. Eric didn't answer. Another elder stepped in. They no longer ask for food. They expect it because of you. Still, Eric said nothing. Saya stepped out from the crowd and walked straight to the fire pit. She stood between Eric and the elders. He gave what you wouldn't, she said. Her voice was soft, but clear. You sit here and guard full bellies while the young starve. The crowd stirred. Someone laughed nervously. Another hissed in warning. One elder stood, face red with shame or anger. Children do not speak at council. He barked, but Saya didn't move. She looked up at Eric, then back at them. "You stopped leading," she whispered, "so we found someone who does." The moment cracked. Like glass, no one knew what to say. Even Eric looked surprised, but he didn't speak. He simply turned and walked away. And Saya followed. Half the children followed her, and the other half. They were already watching, already learning. That night, no food was handed out. The elders claimed it was to teach patience, but the children didn't wait. They gathered near Eric's small fire and shared what little they had. No orders, no plan, just instinct. And when the fire burned high, they began to hum an old lullaby, a human tune, low and strange. Saya had heard him hum it once. And now they all followed her lead. In the shadows, something powerful had begun. Not with weapons, not with speeches, but with a plate, a coat, a fire. And a girl who saw more than most. The elders could not control it because it was already growing in the hearts of those they had forgotten. The storm didn't wait for permission. It came fast, sharp, and without mercy. Dark clouds cracked with green lightning, and the sky tore open like a wound. Acid rain began to fall hissing as it touched broken metal, torn fabric, and bare skin. Panic hit the camp like a hammer. Tents collapsed under the weight of wind. And ash-soaked water, children screamed, adults ran for cover, and the guards those proud. Silent watchers abandoned their posts and disappeared into the main shelter. Eric was the only one running in the opposite direction. He moved through the storm, ignoring the sting on his skin. He found 2 kids trapped under a broken tent pole lifted. With burning hands, Saya was already there, pulling a smaller child out from the mud. Her hands were bleeding, but she didn't stop. Together, they dragged the children toward a half-broken wall near the edge of the camp. Eric shoved loose debris aside, then stacked wood and old blankets into a rough shelter. Rain hissed all around them. But he managed to get the fire started using the last of his dry cloth and a spark tool. It wasn't much, but it was warm. The kids piled in 7, then 10, then more, wet, shivering, silent. Eric stayed outside the flames' reach, soaked, knees deep in mud. He gave them all his coat and lay a piece of plastic over the gap in the roof. His body trembled from cold, but his voice stayed calm. Inside the council tent, the elders argued about what to do. The commander suggested locking the storeroom. Another said, "Let the storm thin the weak." No one mentioned the human. No one asked where the children had gone. By morning, the camp was half underwater. But Eric's little shelter still stood when the rain cleared. The first to step outside weren't the guards or the elders. It was the mothers. One by one, they saw where the fire had burned all night, saw the children asleep in a circle around a shivering human. And they didn't speak. They just walked back into their shelters and returned with food. Not much, some dried root, a few rations. A hard fruit, but they brought it not to the elders. They brought it to Saya, and she fed Eric first. He blinked at the small bite of food in her hand. She didn't speak, just looked at him like she was waiting for his permission to keep going. He took it, slowly, not because he needed it more than the others, but because she needed him to accept it. The rules had changed in a single night. And the ones who had watched from towers were no longer the ones being watched. This time, the people didn't wait for a signal. They had already chosen who they trusted in the dark. And it wasn't the ones hiding inside stone walls. It was the man who stood without shelter. And the girl who didn't ask to lead, but did it anyway. The silence the next day was not peaceful. It was tense, heavy, waiting. Like the ground itself was holding its breath. Word had spread, faster than fire, about the storm, the shelter, the man who stood in the rain, and the children who didn't cry. The elders said nothing, but their guards walked with tighter grips on their weapons. The food store was locked double now, though no one dared to take what wasn't theirs. They weren't afraid of theft. They were afraid of change. Eric sat near the same fire pit, drying out strips of salvaged cloth. His fingers were blistered. But steady, Saya sat beside him, weaving those strips into rope strong, simple, useful. She didn't speak much anymore. She didn't need to. Then came the challenge, a tall alien male, strong, scarred, with the mark of a warrior on his neck, stepped into the circle where the children were playing. He carried no blade, but the tension in his walk was sharp enough. "Human," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "You lead without earning, speak without challenge." Eric didn't respond. The warrior took another step forward. "Do you deny what they say? That you now command their hearts?" Eric stood slowly. He wasn't armed, he wasn't strong, and he didn't posture like a soldier. But his eyes didn't drop. He looked the warrior in the face and simply said, "I've taken nothing, but—" "They follow you," the warrior growled. "They follow hope," Eric replied. "If you think that's a crime, challenge that instead." The warrior's jaw clenched. He declared a trial, not a fight, not a duel, but a test of endurance. Ancient way of proving leadership among the outer clans. A journey into the ruined jungle, plains beyond the camp. No weapons, no food, no guide. Survive and return with proof of life. Eric nodded once, accepting. Saya rushed to him after the crowd scattered. "You don't have to go," she said. Her voice tight, Eric crouched and placed a hand on her shoulder. "They're not testing me," he whispered. "They're testing if the old way still controls them." He left at dawn. No armor, no bag, only a ragged cloak and a calm look in his eyes. The warrior followed half an hour later, arrogant and loud. The camp was quiet after they disappeared into the jungle. Days passed. The children didn't laugh. Saya didn't eat. The fire stayed low, as if waiting for someone to return and breathe life into it again on the fourth night. The warrior's broken blade was found near the edge of the jungle, cracked in half, blood dried along the handle. No body, no proof. The elders said nothing. But Saya whispered to the children, "He's not gone. He promised he'd come back." And they believed her because she never spoke lies. And neither did the man she followed. On the seventh sunrise, before the camp had fully woken. Someone screamed, not in fear, but in disbelief. A figure stumbled through the mist, limping, covered in dried blood, vines, and dirt. Eric, he carried no weapon. No pride, no victory speech. But in his arms, resting against his chest, was a sack of wild root fruit and jungle grain. Rare, nearly extinct, food no one had seen in seasons. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the camp, too tired to stand, one hand still gripping the fruit. His eyes searched the crowd and then landed on one face. Saya was already running before anyone else moved. She knelt beside him and took the sack from his arms as his head bowed forward. He didn't faint, but he was close. Not a single elder came to greet him, but the people did. The mothers, the old, the broken, the ones who had been forgotten. They stepped forward with water, cloth, and silence. The children watched from the circle. Whispering to one another, he came back. He brought food. He didn't leave us. That night, no council spoke. No order was given, but something new happened for the first time. The food was not delivered from the elders' storerooms. It was brought out by the people themselves, from personal stashes, hidden pockets, guarded crumbs, all placed into one pile in the center, beside the fire. Saya organized the circle. Eric, barely able to stand, sat wrapped in blankets nearby, silent, and she began to hand the food out. Not by age, not by caste, but by need. An old alien with shaking hands received a full meal. A young mother with twin children got double rations. No one argued because Saya didn't demand respect. She earned it with every breath, just like him, later, when the fire had died to embers. Eric looked at her through half-lidded eyes. "You led them," he whispered. Saya only nodded. You showed me how. The stars above blinked through clouds, and for the first time in many nights. The camp felt quiet not because it was afraid, but because it finally rested. The man they tried to test had returned. But he had brought back more than food. He had brought something no trial could measure: trust. The next morning, no horn sounded, no speech was made, and no elder stood before the camp. Yet somehow, everyone knew where to go. They gathered slowly around the center fire, the same fire that once belonged to no one, but now burned because of him. Children sat close, not out of hunger, but to listen. Mothers brought cloth and water without being asked. Fathers stood at the edges, watching in silence, waiting for what came next. Eric remained seated, legs stretched out, wounds wrapped in fresh bandages. He wasn't strong yet, not physically. But his presence, quiet, calm, steady, was heavier than any weapon. Saya stood beside him, but this time she didn't follow. She spoke. "There is no council today," she said, facing the crowd. "There are no guards, no orders." People looked at one another, unsure, then slowly nods. Whispers of agreement, acceptance. Eric raised one hand. Only once. It wasn't a command. It was a thank you. Someone stepped forward and laid a hand-carved bowl in front of him. A gift, simple and honest. Others followed. A clean shirt, a polished stone, a jar of preserved root, a hand-woven bracelet from a child. They weren't offerings. They were acknowledgments, not to a ruler, but to someone who had changed them without taking anything, without raising his voice, without lifting a blade. Later that day, a strange mark was drawn in the dirt outside the food shelter. A circle with a human handprint in the middle, and smaller alien symbols surrounding it. Nobody claimed to have drawn it, but no one erased it either. That night, for the first time, no one ate alone. Saya passed the last piece of dried fruit to Eric. He tried to refuse, like always, but she placed it in his hand and said, "Leaders don't need to be hungry anymore." He laughed softly. "Then I guess I need to learn how to eat again." She smiled back. "You already taught us how to live." Above them, the stars were no longer hidden behind clouds. And in a camp once ruled by silence, a quiet man and a bold little girl had become the voice of a new beginning, not chosen by blood, not crowned by power, but followed because they gave everything when they had nothing, and asked for nothing when they were given everything.